Hello YouTube, I'm Andrew Does Hair. You could find my work on Instagram at Andrew Does Hair. Okay, I know a lot of you followed me for hair, and it seems in the past couple months I'm really going off about cameras often. The reason for this is in my little hair community, the scene that I've been a part of for so many years, a lot of people are using cameras to try to improve their online portfolio, and there's just not like a really solid resource out there that I've found specifically geared towards salon and barbershops. And so that's why I go so hard on it. A common question that I get, very, very common, is what's a good first camera for the salon or barbershop? I want to take the best portraits possible for as cheap as possible. And I actually do have a couple videos that kind of touch on this, one that is specifically that exact answer. But in that video, I don't say use this specific camera. I kind of tell you what to look for as far as specs and features go. But if I were to take all the specs and features, the camera that I had in my mind when I made that video is the Canon 6D. So in this video, what I would like to do is compare this Canon 6D to a relatively brand new, it's part of their newest line, Canon R6. Essentially by the end of the video, I hope you'll see why for the salon and the barbershop, this is kind of the way to go. Or if you got money to burn, sure, get one of these. This is really, really nice and really, really fun to use. But at the end of the day, is it worth $2,500 versus $400? We're gonna find out. So the Canon 6D was released in 2012. This was kind of the younger sibling to the 5D series. It has a full frame sensor, but it doesn't have the crazy sophisticated autofocus system. This was released around $1,900 when it was new, and today you can find them for $400 or $500. So the Canon R6 came out in 2020. This thing retails $2,500. There's an 8-year spread between these cameras. There's a lot of technology that's changed in that time. Now, similar to the way that the 6D is kind of the little brother to the 5D, the R6 is like the little sibling to the R5. The Canon R5 is a flagship camera. It is a freaking incredible machine that's like $4,000. This has a lot of the same features and functionality, but it's like the cheaper, lower resolution version of it. A lot of people have said that the R6 is the modern equivalent to the 6D. Makes sense, they both have 6 in the name, and they're the slightly cheaper alternatives to the cameras with 5 in their name. So covering now the age and the cost of these, let's move forward to the image quality. They both have roughly 20 megapixel full frame sensors. I would say as far as shooting still life, like a client sitting in a salon, the image quality out of these is basically identical. If you're casually shooting for Instagram, you cannot see the difference. And any of your viewers on Instagram will not see the difference. So the image quality on these is, I'm not gonna say identical because some nerds can get out there and pull up charts and graphs and compare images like very scientifically and go, no, the R6 is way better. For the most part, they actually have the same image quality, the same roughly 20 megapixels, the same full frame sensor. They're just wrapped up in much different bells and whistles. Let's talk about the viewfinders on these. The 6D is a DSLR, digital single lens reflex camera. There's a mirror inside of there to where when you look through the viewfinder, you're looking through a prism off of a mirror and then through the actual lens. You're seeing through the lens the actual light in the environment bouncing around in there and coming to your eyeball. Now with the R6, this is a mirrorless camera. There's no mirror in there. There's just a sensor behind the lens, and then the sensor is putting out a digital image into a small screen inside of the viewfinder. When mirrorless cameras came out, everyone's like, this is the way of the future, it's better in every way. There are benefits to the mirrorless, and there are benefits to the optical viewfinder. And I feel like I'm kind of alone when I complain about some of these issues, but when you're looking at the little screen inside the mirrorless camera, the benefit is what you see is what you get. You can see your exposure as you're getting the photo. And so as you're learning photography, this can be much easier because you'll know before you take the photo whether it's too bright or too dark. To where when you're looking through this viewfinder, it doesn't matter what the camera settings are, everything will always look the same through that viewfinder. However, the benefits I find to the optical viewfinder is there are cases where the camera just can't resolve detail in a specific scenario because it's too bright or it's too dark. And so you're limited with the electronic viewfinder to only seeing what the camera can perceive. But with the optical viewfinder, your eye can perceive a lot more than the camera can. And so you're able to see a lot more detail in the scene. And at times, backlit scenarios, or if you're deliberately trying to blow something out or hide something in shadows, I find it's a lot easier, a lot nicer to shoot with the optical viewfinder. The other benefit to the optical viewfinder is if you were to pick this up without turning it on, if I had a lens on here, I could look through it and I could frame up my shot. I wouldn't have to wait for anything to turn on, to load. If I have this sitting and I want to just look at a shot real quick, there's a few seconds waiting for everything to sort of boot up. But with this, at any given time, if I look, I can frame up the shot. Let's talk about the build quality. The Canon 6D came out during an era when Canon was making absolute tanks and bricks of cameras. This thing feels like a brick in your hand. Like you feel like you could knock someone out with this. The R6 has a similar kind of girthy, chunky feel to it, but it's a lot lighter. It feels more hollow in comparison. I feel like when I was working with 6Ds years ago, when it was like not an old camera, I never worried about bumping the camera or anything. With the R6, I am a little bit more careful with it. It doesn't feel like it could take a punch as well. And I'm not about to go test it and find out, but the build quality, I really think the old saying, oh, they don't make them like they used to. I think that really goes here. The 6D feels so robust and so like just good. And this feels a little bit plastic and a little bit hollow by comparison. Comparing the size of these cameras, and mind you, right now I have battery extension grips installed on both of these. With or without the extension grips, the size is really dang near identical. There is just ever so slightly the R6 is smaller, but not by enough that it would change the way you pack, and not by enough that it would change really anything about how you use the camera. Let's talk about the ergonomics a little bit. Back in the 6D era, I never had a complaint about the ergonomics. It just felt really good in the hand. In fact, I would say the grip feels better than on the R6. I think it feels my hand a little bit better. Maybe it's because it's ever so slightly bigger, but also I noticed that this edge here is a little bit rounded on the 6D where it's flat on the R6. So when I hold this, I can feel contact against my hand all the way around, and it feels good. This does not feel bad by any means, but 10% worse, I would say. As far as the button layout, the 6D, brilliant button layout. Like Canon got that right back then, and then they got it wrong with the RP and the EOS R, and then they got it right again with the R6 and the R5. They went back to more of a traditional layout. You can see comparing these cameras, the R6 and the 6D have pretty similar button layouts. Like they're slightly different, but most of the same buttons are in most of the same places. And so 8 years later, if you go from classic Canon to a modern Canon, the button layout is very, very similar, and the feel of each camera is very, very similar. Let's talk about the controls on these cameras. When I was using the 6D back in the day, I never felt like there was a lack of controls. I never felt like I needed something to be quicker or more intuitive. It felt pretty good. But then when I got the R6 years later, going back to the 6D, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's not a lot of control here. I mean, there is. I'll put it this way. There's not a ton of things you can change on this camera, but it's also a very simple camera as far as the way the autofocus and everything works. And so granted, there's less quick change things on the fly, but there's less things to change. It's more of a straightforward, simple camera. And on top of it, a lot of the added benefits to the R6, as far as control goes, it's kind of like you would never miss it if you never had it in the first place, one of those kind of things. So on the R6, I've got 3 dials that I can reach with my right hand: my shutter speed, my ISO, and my aperture. Right hand, one-handed only. On the 6D, I've got shutter speed and I've got aperture, but there's no dedicated knob for ISO. And so if I hold the set button and scroll this wheel, I can change the ISO. So it's still one-handed operation, but having 3 knobs is just ever so slightly more intuitive. Furthermore, on the R6, with the RF lenses, you have an extra control ring added to the lenses. What I use that for personally is white balance. And it's one of those things, like I never with the 6D did I need to change white balance so frequently that I wished it was on a ring. But after having a control ring that can change my white balance, I'm like, that's really, really nice. And now I kind of never want to not have it. Let's talk about user customization. With the 6D, you can go in and customize most of the buttons on it to do a handful of different things. It's got some good customization, but again, being that it's a simpler camera, it doesn't have a ton of things that it can do. With the R6, you can customize everything, and the options are incredible. Like this camera, if you sit and dig in the menus for 20 minutes and you set up all the buttons the way you like them, it is your camera after that. And you can customize almost every button on it to do so many crazy things. So the customization is decent on the 6D and wonderful on the R6. Let's talk about these lens mounts. So the 6D uses Canon's EF mount. This lens mount has been around for like 30 years. The market for it is just vast. You can find amazing lenses for relatively cheap, especially now that it's been kind of discontinued as far as I understand. But there's still tons and tons and tons of legendary, beautiful, wonderful options in EF lenses. However, this camera cannot take the new RF lenses. This camera cannot take EFM lenses. This camera cannot take EFS lenses, which are the smaller lenses made for crop sensor or APS-C cameras. So this can use one kind of lens, but it's a cheaper, more plentiful, legendary lens mount. You can find these lenses anywhere. Go on eBay and you'll find that like just tons and tons and tons of EF lenses. Now with the R6, it uses Canon's RF mount. And with an adapter, it can easily use EF lenses. However, it can also use EFS lenses and not the EFM lenses. I kind of hate the EFM mount, the M series cameras, for this reason. They're kind of like stuck in their own little world with their own little lenses. But point being, this camera with the adapter can use pretty much almost every Canon lens that there is. It's a very, very, very flexible lens mount. On top of that, the RF lenses are Canon's future. If you were to buy a newer modern camera like this with the RF mount, anything Canon releases lens-wise for years to come is going to fit this camera. However, with the 6D, I don't think they're producing EF lenses anymore. There's still a billion of them out there used, but I don't think they're coming out with new ones anymore. Let's talk about autofocus for a second. This is, I think, probably one of the biggest things different between these cameras. With the Canon 6D, you have a relatively simple autofocus system. There's like a diamond pattern of dots in the viewfinder, and you can select any one or all of those dots to be your focus point. And so essentially the camera can focus exactly on those dots, and that's it. Now there's a method where you can lock focus on a dot and then recompose the image, making it somewhat quick and flexible to use, but it's pretty much an outdated, archaic system. And I don't want that to scare people off and go, oh, it's like an old system. It's been beyond good enough for photographers for years and years and years now. It's just not as easy for someone who's never touched a camera to pick up and know how to use it. Now with the R6, it has incredible autofocus. It's smart and intelligent. You're able to look at the little screen in there and the focus point will it'll know what you want to shoot and it'll follow it for you. Like, I don't want to get too deep into it, but essentially it's smart. It's like that's a face. We're focusing on that eyeball right there. It just knows. Guy turns around and it knows, okay, we're going to focus on the back of his head now. With this one, you have to manually go in and say, I want to focus on that thing with that dot. I want to focus on that thing with that dot. And so the focus operation is wildly, vastly, crazy different on these. I personally like kind of using the older autofocus system just because I used it for so many years and it feels like photography to me, where this feels like the camera's just doing the work for me. And so there are times where I want the camera to do the work for me, and there are times where I want to enjoy the fun of doing the work and working the autofocus system. Now I will say, when I'm working in the salon and I have a coworker who doesn't know anything about photography, but I got my camera there and I got my lights set up and they're like, hey, I just finished a cool haircut, can I use your camera? I love when that happens, and I'm constantly handing my cameras to my coworkers and saying, here you go, just push this button and I'll get it all set up for them. With the R6, the autofocus system is so ridiculously easy. I can hand them the camera and say, just push that button, and they're good to go. With the 6D though, if I hand them this, they go, oh, there's no picture on the screen, and we'll get into that in a minute. And I go, no, you got to put it on your eye, and then you got to put those dots on the thing you want to focus on, and then you got to, like, and so it's a little bit harder to use. And I found like half of my coworkers, if I have this camera with me at work, they're like, hey, let me use your camera real quick. If I have this camera, they look at it and they go, I'll just use my phone. But don't let that deter you. It's an afternoon of learning how to use the autofocus system, and then after that, you're good. As far as video goes, and I don't want to get too much into video in this because I'm not really like a video guy, the autofocus in the R6 is incredible. It's got face tracking. It's got, it's just really, really nice and smooth. But the autofocus for video with the 6D is non-existent. It does not focus during video. And so that was actually one of the big reasons I left the 6D to get more modern cameras, is when I started doing YouTube videos, I was like, I need something that's gonna follow focus on my face. This can't do that, this can. I'm kind of rethinking a little bit of this now, all this money I dumped into my modern cameras, because lately I've just been shooting all my YouTube videos with my iPhone, as I'm doing right now. And man, if I could just do all of YouTube with my iPhone, I might not need a $2,500 camera anymore. Now, even if you were to turn off the autofocus and manually focus your camera by turning the ring on the lens like a dinosaur, with the R6 you have what's called focus peaking, meaning anything in focus on the screen or in the viewfinder is going to be highlighted in some color. I have mine set to red, which I think is default. On the 6D, you don't have that functionality. If you were to manually focus, you got to look at it and use your eyes and hope that you're not blind and find that focus the old-fashioned way. Let's talk about burst rates. Now, this is very unimportant for salon use or still photos. If you're shooting still life or a model who's sitting there posing, you don't need a fast burst rate, but it's worth mentioning. With the 6D, there's a decent burst rate, decent at best. It's bad to decent. With the R6, it's ridiculously fast. I think you get 13 photos a second with mechanical shutter, or 20 photos a second with electronic shutter. That's another benefit. This can shoot absolutely silently, like literally silent if you need it to. This can shoot slightly quieter if you need it to, but really not much quieter. It like reduces the click sound. And on top of it, the crazy autofocus of the R6 is going to continue doing its work while it's shooting these 13 or 20 photos a second, where with the 6D, the autofocus, if you're shooting a moving subject and you're trying to get a burst of photos there, it struggles. It struggles. Okay, let's talk about something called live view. That's when you turn on the back screen of your camera to view what the camera is looking at. Now the 6D does have live view, but it's very primitive compared to the R6. With the 6D, your autofocus in live view is very, very slow. And when you go to take the photo, you get this blackout. There's a lot of shutter lag, like you hit the shutter button and it feels like it waits a second and then it takes the photo. It's just not very fast. When you're using live view with the 6D, you cannot use flash, it doesn't work. You can't look through the viewfinder if you need to real quick for whatever reason. The screen doesn't flip out, it doesn't articulate, so it's just fixed there. You have to look at it this way. And so it can be done. And the benefit to doing it is you can see your exposure before you take the photo. And so for people learning, live view is oftentimes a lot easier, but it's very slow and very cumbersome with this camera. It does have a very primitive early form of Canon's like face tracking, but it's so slow. It can be done. Standing in a salon or a barbershop with a still subject, you can sit there and you can make it happen. When you're shooting with the 6D, if you're shooting through the viewfinder, it's going to be tremendously faster than shooting with live view, and it's just going to work better all around. Now with the R6, going from the viewfinder to live view, there's no difference in the camera's performance. It shoots just as fast. You can use flash this way. Because the screen flips out and turns around and all this, you can look at it and get, unusual angles that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. Because this is a touch screen, if you are shooting with live view, you can simply touch the thing you want to focus on. Very easy. So it's really fast and really intuitive to shoot that way. Going back to what I complained about with the electronic viewfinder versus optical viewfinder in the first place, I find myself with the R6 only using the viewfinder if I need to shut out the world around me. It's kind of like when you're driving and you turn down the radio so you can see better on the road. If I'm trying to cut out the world around me, that's when I use the viewfinder here. But what I find is because of the complaints I made earlier about the electronic viewfinder, if I'm shooting in live view this way, looking at the back, and I need to glance at what's really happening, it's a lot easier to shoot this way than it is to go like this. There used to be this belief that if you're standing there shooting, looking at the back of your camera instead of using the viewfinder, there used to be this kind of belief that it means you're not professional, you're not a real photographer. I find since I've got the wonderful live view with this camera, it is so much quicker to just go and just shoot without even getting my head in the game. It's so much easier to just spray and pray this way. Let's talk about the batteries in these cameras. They both use a battery that is the same shape and size. It's the Canon LPE6 battery. It's been around for a long time, and what they've done in recent years is they improved the capacity without changing the shape or the size of the battery. So the great thing is you can kind of interchange them. But even with the higher capacity in the newer battery for the R6, it still doesn't get as many shots out of a charge as the 6D does. So you see with the mirrorless camera, there's constantly power running through the sensor and to the viewfinder. You constantly have a screen on, and basically if the camera's on, it's draining the battery. To where with the DSLR, the sensor's not pulling any juice until as you take the photo. You can get so many shots out of a DSLR. I haven't done an actual test yet to see how many shots I can get out of each before the battery dies, but paying attention to when I feel like I need to charge the cameras, I definitely get way more out of the 6D than I do out of the R6. Let's talk about some accessories here. As I said earlier, I have these battery grips installed on these cameras. The battery grip for the R6 is $350. I was able to find a battery grip for the 6D for $80. Now these things are totally not necessary, but I like them because then I think about my battery life half as often. There's two batteries in here versus one battery that would sit in the camera by itself. But to get a little add-on like that for a 10-year-old camera, it's cheap. It's really, really cheap. So I mean, between what I paid for the body and the grip here, I cannot believe how cheap this is and the image quality that I can get out of it. It does lack a lot of the functionality we've been talking about, but $350 grip versus $80 grip. And you could probably even find them cheaper if you look around. Another thing that's different between these cameras is the card slots. On the 6D, you have one SD card. On the R6, you have two SD cards. Now, most people who care about that are worried that the card's gonna go bad or fail, and you're gonna have a backup card if you have two in there. I understand that completely. It's never been that important to me because I haven't had a card fail. I'm gonna knock on wood. So I wanna talk about kind of ease of use here in the sense of what I'm gonna call selfie features. Being a content creator for Instagram, sometimes I need pictures of myself cutting hair. With the 6D, the best I can do is set it up on a tripod, focus it while I'm at the tripod on my haircut, which won't move because he's sitting in a chair, and then set a self timer to go off at the, in 10 seconds, it'll take a picture of me cutting hair. With the R6, I'm able to turn on what's called continuous focus, meaning it's going to, without holding any focus button, it'll just keep focusing on me. I can turn on what's called the interval timer, which is essentially every 1 second or 2 seconds or 5 seconds or minute or whenever, however far you want to set it, it'll automatically take a picture. And so if I throw this on a tripod, I can flip the screen around to see myself while I'm working in front of it. It's continually focusing on me and it's shooting a picture every second. So like the kind of selfie-ish features are way easier with this camera. Okay, the final thing I want to talk about, I'm sorry it's been such a long video, but there's so much to cover, is in-body image stabilization. So the sensor in the R6 is actually stabilized, meaning if I'm using a slow shutter speed while I'm shooting a photo and the camera's shaking at all, the sensor will actually move and stabilize that movement to reduce the amount of blur in the image. The 6D does not have that. If I'm hand-holding video with the R6 and I have a little bit of shake in there, it's going to stabilize it to some degree. With the 6D, if I'm hand-holding video, it's shaky. I personally have never felt like, oh, I need in-body stabilization. I can't wait till I can have that in my Canon camera, because Canon was kind of late to the game with that. But once I had it, I was like, okay, that is really nice. But it's not a deal breaker for me. It's just like a nice luxury to have. And I kind of forget about it most of the time until I don't have it. And then I go, oh, okay, maybe I do kind of want that. All right, so now that I've rambled for a very, very long time here, if you're still here at this point, I really, really appreciate it. I'll try to wrap it up really quickly here. If you're shooting in a salon or barbershop, you're not trying to be a photographer, you're just trying to get really high quality images for your Instagram account, you don't need all the bells and whistles that the Canon R6 offers. If you have the money for an R6, I highly, highly recommend, instead of getting an R6, get the 6D, get a really nice lens, and get a set of lights and maybe a couple photography courses. For the salon and barbershop, so much of what the R6 can do is just literal overkill. To take simple photos, of a still sitting person in a well-lit room, it's like overkill. And I would say, as I mentioned earlier, since I've been doing a lot of my YouTube stuff with an iPhone now, I'm like, dang, maybe I don't even need those video features. So I don't know, at the end of the day, really, I just wanted to put this together because I think it's really interesting, the differences between the cameras. And a lot of people I talk to as they're going to buy a camera, they assume the biggest difference is going to be in the image quality. But I kind of wanted to do this video to point out that the differences are almost everything except the image quality. And so if you're shooting in a situation where you have time to focus the old-fashioned way, and you have time to compose your image, as we do with haircut photos, maybe you don't need all the bells and whistles. Maybe you'd be a lot happier with a much cheaper camera.